When we talk about the greatest collapses in history, you may think of the Roman Empire, the Atlanta Falcons in Super Bowl 51, or Hawk Tuacoin. But there's another fall so egregious that I think it not only needs to be included, but someone should be charged for it. And that is the collapse of the Seven Deadly Sins anime. However, for there to be a collapse, one so massive it should be criminal, that means things had to have been good at one point. If it always sucked, no one would care. We're going to start here because I have so much love for the first few seasons of Seven Deadly Sins, and I want to show why the fall cut so deep. Look, this is not the first time someone has made a video on this, far from it, but this is coming from a different place than some of the others, because this was once, legitimately, my favorite anime. A lot of times people don't give it credit or gloss over the fact that it was popular for a reason. It all starts with the characters. Being up front, they shouldn't work. Meliodas is a perv demon. Ban is all about that lolly. King has sus taste, and Gowther, well, yeah. When you spend more than a few seconds thinking about it, this is probably the most problematic protagonist group in anime, yet I adored them. Don't really know what that says about me, but regardless, their interactions were so fun, and no matter what they did, where they did it, or who they did it with, it was entertaining. It's the first series I'd ever seen where the characters could be hanging out and chatting, or going to pick up food, or doing chores, and I'd still be glued to my screen. I would have watched an entire season of these guys sitting in traffic. And there was so much hype to go along with that. I may be on my own here, but when they revealed in episode 1 who Meliodas was, I was in. The next episode, he's catching Gil Thunder's spear and whipping it back with Tom Brady-esque accuracy. A few episodes later, we get a surprisingly layered relationship between Ban, Elaine, and King. Legitimately moving stuff that made you care. There was all of the mystery surrounding Meliodas and what he was, who he was, and what the hell had gone on in his past. The way it slowly unraveled was another thing that kept you hooked. Each fight felt unique and fresh. King's fight with Helbram was surprisingly impactful. Meliodas versus Hendrickson and seeing Revenge Counter for the first time was incredible. When Galland pops up and slaughters Meliodas and Deanne with ease, the Ten Commandments felt like they were going to be unstoppable. Elaine returned, except not as herself. Meliodas revealed a huge amount of his power was taken, and not only did he get it back, but we saw the trauma of his past in the process, and that too was amazing to watch. We were introduced to the Hype King himself, Escanor, whose cucking of Galland is an all-time anime debut and one of my favorite moments to watch reactions to. His showdown with Gowther, all-time underrated. The fight with Estarossa gave us one of the most iconic lines ever. Meliodas versus the Ten Commandments was the peak of the show. The hype, the shock, the tragedy, all of it. How much it meant for Ban to come for him after trying to sacrifice him earlier. Revisionist history will tell you these things were good. No, they were great, but that was the calm before the storm. Before we get to that, it should be noted that even the character arcs were good on paper. Meliodas is able to control his emotions. King accepted his duty as the Fairy King. Ban gave up his immortality. Escanor gave up his life for others, and so on. All of these characters overcame their sins. Ironically, one of the greatest moments the show had kind of symbolically signaled the show was cooked. When Meliodas dies at Esterossa's hands, it was unbelievable. Unfortunately, the show died along with him. Despite having good moments after that, the consistency was never the same. This is where I need to get blunt. Seven Deadly Sins was at its best when it was simple. The plot was never the strength of the show. When it tried to get complex, it ended up convoluted, and when paired with all the other issues it had, that made it unsalvageable. So where to start? It's all such a mess that you can really pick anything. The animation, the action became generic, the character moments were cut in half, the plot was messy as hell, the animation, the censoring of blood multiple seasons in, sacred treasures didn't matter, the animation. Let's start with the Ten Commandments. Their debut was god tier, and they felt like such a massive threat right away. And then they were all completely sidelined or cucked. When the goddess race popped up, they took a lot of the spotlight, except those characters don't have a fraction of the charisma the Commandments had. Plus, each individual character's commandment stopped mattering basically out of the blue when that was half of what made them so difficult to deal with. When you're fighting someone and you're unable to lie, or battle with hate in your heart, or can't turn your back on your enemy without being enslaved, that makes it really hard to win. Same for the Sacred Treasures. Post Meliodas' death, they just don't matter at all. Anyone watching this video probably knows the series changed studios, and with a rushed schedule, the new animation fell off a cliff. You could maybe give them a pass for the first season they had due to the schedule, but when the animation was still awful the next season, that excuse vanished like Goku when it was time to be a dad. And why the censorship? We had multiple seasons with gritty, bloody fights. What could possibly be the logic for taking it out halfway through the show, especially when anyone with a brain knew they'd have to bring it back? It's indefensible. If anyone should be charged with a crime, it's whatever idiot made that decision, and they should serve life because you can't fix that level of stupid. Speaking of stupid, everything they do with Estarossa post-studio change is terrible. I hated how they turned him from what felt like the ultimate big bad and a compelling character into a fanboy, and then into a memory-wiped angel, and then had him take Escanor, an infinitely cooler character's power, and say it originated with him. Mael basically epitomizes everything wrong with that second half of the series. Is that bad writing or a bad adaptation? I don't know, but it sucked. How about every single fight the last few seasons? Remember when the fights were fresh? I do. I gave a handful of examples earlier. I'd like to do so again, but in the second half, every one of these fights were so bland and generic that they all blend together. The only ones I specifically remember were the ones too terrible to forget. Speaking of Meliodas vs. Escanor, also file charges for that. There is no excuse. Treat that person like Diddy, because I was violated against my will watching that. Also, it's baffling how all the creativity the series had vanished in an instant. We're introduced to the real big bad, the Demon King, and somehow he's about as interesting as watching paint dry, and gave us one of the lamest final fights ever, and one that cost us Escanor. Then we have Merlin's turn and the chaos nonsense. Thankfully, Four Knights has been doing some work to make it better, but in the original series, it felt like it came out of nowhere and completely bombed. And you know what? Despite all of this crap, the show still could have potentially worked. Because like I said, the characters were what made the series. Except, we were given such a drastically reduced amount of downtime that it forced the show to become more plot-focused as opposed to character-focused. The characters were the show's greatest strength, and somehow a decision was made to pivot away from that. You won't hear this often, but honestly, this series might have done better with more filler. The plot was always a little sloppy, but you could ignore it because it was never the main focus. When it's pushed to the forefront, the issues become glaring, especially because you're looking at stick figures or charisma vacuums while it's happening. That's the series' greatest sin, and to me, it's criminal. With that, I'm out.